Okay, I assume that people will keep coming in, but as I try to have these at least these English-speaking events starting on time to prove to native-born Israelis that we Anglos can start on time. All right, so good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. Welcome to the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. My name. I can hear a phone. Okay. Let that be the last reminder, guys. Phones off, please. True story. My phone went off under the chuppah. That's true. So I know the 12 years later she has not forgiven me. Okay. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the centre, and it's great to see all of you here for what I think will be a really fascinating evening. I just think many of you have come to our events here before. We're looking to inform and educate about the issues that were of importance to Menachem Begin, Israel's sixth Prime Minister, Israel's flourishing as a Jewish state and democratic state, and the safety and the security of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And it's in those last three words, the Jewish people, that I think lies the uniqueness really of Menachem Begin as Israel's Prime Minister. He was much more than any of the Prime Ministers who preceded him, and I think could be argued any Prime Minister since, first and foremost a Jew. Before he was an Israeli, before he was anything else, he was a Jew. And of course, if you want to explore that aspect of his personality, that aspect of his character, the best book to read is Daniel Gordis's biography of Menachem Begin, which focuses very much on that aspect of him. And as you'll read there, this was a man who saw it as his responsibility as Israeli Prime Minister to rescue the Jews of Ethiopia and to fight for the rights of the Jews of the former Soviet Union. A man who, in the words of Dan Meridor, spoke Jewish. A man who concluded his speech on the White House lawn after the signing of the peace treaty with Egypt by taking out a kippah and reciting Shir Hamalot in Hebrew without translation. And this makes our topic tonight supremely relevant for this centre as an institution, and also, I think, relevant for an English-speaking audience. Many of you sitting here are, like me, as I'm sure you've guessed, Olim. You have a foot in both camps, in Israel and in the diaspora communities from which you came. Many of you are Americans, by far the largest and most well-integrated Jewish diaspora of our time and indeed of all time. And we'll hear first tonight from Daniel Gordis about his new book, We Stand Divided, which details the history of the growing apart of Israel and American Jewry. Next we'll hear from Annika Hernroth-Rothstein, who will take us to the other extreme. Small, often beleaguered Jewish communities across the globe feeling, perhaps unlike most American Jews, that they are very much in exile, which is the title of her new book. And finally, Shmuel Rosner will bring us home to Israel with his new book, Israeli Judaism, about the development of a new kind of Judaism being forged here in Israel, a Judaism which perhaps further separates the Jewish culture here from what exists elsewhere in the world. After their presentations, I'm going to invite everyone back on stage to have a short discussion to answer your questions, and I think it's going to be a really enlightening evening. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, one of the most renowned commentators in English on Israel and American Jewry, and on the relationship between them, Dr. Daniel Gordis, the Senior Vice President and Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College, the author of 12 books, two of them recipients of the National Jewish Book Award. He's a regular columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He's also a great friend of this institution. It's always a privilege to welcome him to speak here, and here he is speaking about his most recent book, We Stand Divided, The Rift Between American Jews and Israel. Dr. Daniel Gordis.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's really an honor, and in the tradition of Hakarat Tov, I'll just begin by saying I think more than I am a friend of the institution. The institution was extremely wonderful to me during those years that I was working on the Begin biography, so my gratitude to the Menachem Begin Heritage Center and all of the people that work there still remains very much in place, and I thought it would be inappropriate not to mention the great kindness that they showed me. We are all three going to try to hold ourselves to a relatively fixed period of time. Obviously, each of us has a book out there, so we could each talk about the book for a long, long period, but we want to try to open it up. And so we'll take a very, very brief amount of time and in kind of bullet point form, try to share with you what the basic thesis of the book is. And even though obviously there's going to be a lot of detail that we'll skip tonight, and I want to do something that's not in the book, which is to reflect a little bit on how recent changes in America that have taken place since the book was published, or since the book was finished, certainly more than a year ago, might have some impact on the things that we're talking about. The basic premise of the book, of course, or the basic subject of the book, is the relationship between American Jews and Israel. And the assumption, the prevailing conventional wisdom out there is that it was really all good until a certain point and then it went south. And my basic premise in the book is that that's actually fundamentally incorrect. It was always bad, except when it was good. Which is to say, it was bad from approximately 1921, which predates the state by a quarter of a century, until the present time, with a very brief honeymoon in the middle, more or less, between June 67 and Sabra and Shatila in 82. In Sabra and Shatila in 82, there was already the beginning of tremendous erosion of American Jewish support. It ebbed and flowed in all different kinds of ways because of a whole array of things. But there was obviously the huge elation after June 1967, which American Jews got caught up in, Soviet Jews got caught up in it, and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, the relationship between American Jews and Israel has always been problematic. It's not actually a relatively late development. Now, since it's always been problematic, and I'll give you a couple of examples in just a minute, but since it's been problematic for a very, very, very long time, that also upends one of the other classic conventional wisdoms, which is that the reason for the problematic relationship is things like the conflict/occupation, which is not to say that those are good things. It's just to say they're not the reasons for this, whatever. I'm not taking a stand on any of the following issues. Things like the Kotel, things like the nation-state law, all these kinds of, the idea of getting rid of 40,000 asylum seekers who were unquestionably here illegally, but were also human beings who were going to be sent back to a place where their end would not have been pretty. The conventional argument is that American Jews who fundamentally trend liberal, not left, but liberal, and those are not the same thing, that fundamentally trend liberal, the kind of hyper-nationalistic and conflict-woven world in which Israel finds itself was something that they simply can't abide, and that's the reason for the relationship being so troubled. And the argument therefore goes, especially vis-a-vis the conflict and the occupation, if that only went away, the relationship would heal. That, I think, is not the case. And because I fundamentally imply that that's not the case in the book, people on the left in the United States who think that the occupation is the major thing did not like the book. And if they were people who had been asked by the New York Times to write about the book, they had no compunction saying they did not like the book. Which is, of course, why they have a job at the New York Times. They're supposed to write what they think. But I also got to write what I thought about what they think. So I will commend to you Judith Shulovitz's review of the book in the New York Times and my response to Judith Shulevitz in a very long blog post in the Times of Israel. And if you ever can't fall asleep at night, that will either put you to sleep or completely wake you up, depending on your perspective. But my argument in the book is that because the tensions between the two communities goes back to 21 and 48 and 60. We'll come to those in just a second. It's obviously not the occupation, because the occupation comes later. It's not the nation-state law, which comes later. It's not the Kotel. All those things come later. And again, I don't want to be taken out of context. Those are all critically important issues. And anyone would be wrong to belittle the impact that they are going to have on Israel's moral and social and Jewish nature, regardless of which side of the divide you are on any of those things. Doesn't make any difference at the moment. They are hugely critical issues. I just don't want to be misunderstood as suggesting that just because I think they're not the cause of the root divide between American Jews and Israel, that they're not important. They're critically important. Some of them may determine the kind of country this eventually becomes, but they're not the reason for the divide. How do I know that? Just give you a very, very brief example. In 1921, there is a blow-up between Chaim Weizmann, who comes in from Europe, and Louis Brandeis, who was then the titular head of the International Zionist Movement. Brandeis has been writing for years about how American Jews, this is not a misquote, American Jews should become Zionists because being a Zionist will make you a better American. Now, he says we would never move there. He says that explicitly. Neither we nor our children would actually ever move there, but we should be Zionists because it's a kind of a process of becoming a better American. Why he said that and what was the relationship between him and Woodrow Wilson and why what Wilson was saying about naturalization forced Brandeis to say that, we don't have time to go into tonight, but suffice it to say that for European Zionists who are trying to build a real live state in the face of what they predict is a Europe that's going to go south, and they have no idea how far south it's going to go. This idea that we should be Zionists because it's going to make us better Americans seemed not only ludicrous, but it seemed actually somewhat heretical in its own way. And this leads to a whole push and shove budgetarily, committee-wise, and the whole rings we can't go into now. 1921, Weizmann flies to America. They meet in Chicago, and when Weizmann leaves America, he has wrested control of the international Zionist movement away from Louis Brandeis, which is why, by the way, many people who know a lot of things about Louis Brandeis have no idea that he was once the head of the international Zionist movement, because the victor tells the narrative, right? And so the victor was the European Zionist camp, and Louis Brandeis was in some ways written out of it. But this is already a battle a quarter of a century before the state. 1949, 1950, Jacob Blaustein, who's the head of the American Jewish Committee, and David Ben-Gurion have an enormous blow-up. Blaustein is annoyed that Ben-Gurion is coming to America and saying that there is a new center of the Jewish world. Right? And Blaustein says, yeah, but there's more Jews in New York City than in your entire country. So how exactly do you get to this new center of a Jewish world thing? And before he can even answer that question, Ben-Gurion says, oh, and by the way, all of you American Jews should come to Israel, which also annoyed Blaustein no end. The end of the day, a very long story, which is much more discussed in the book, which we can't go into now. They signed what's called the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion Agreement, which David Ben-Gurion, being Jewish, of course, proceeds to violate 3 times a day in traditional fashion. Blaustein also, by the way, had his share of blame too, but Ben-Gurion was much more egregious. But this is a huge blow-up, and by the way, in the midst of the blow-up, before they signed this agreement, Blaustein was explicit. If you don't cut this stuff out, we are going to withhold financial support for the state of Israel, diplomatic support, and political support. Pick. In other words, this is holding Israel, kind of with a gun to its forehead, saying, cut this out. And Ben-Gurion more or less does it. But nonetheless, this is also a huge rupture, which I'm minimizing now just because of time, but it's a huge rupture between what's then, of course, already the state of Israel and the leadership of American Judaism, nothing to do with the occupation, which nobody knows anything about in 1949, right? 1960, the rumor goes that Ben-Gurion has an important announcement to make to the Knesset then being at the top of Ben Yehuda on King George. Go to the top, make a left, cross the street, 50 yards down. They're now building a museum, if I'm not mistaken, of the history of the Knesset. That's where it was then. It moves to this current spot, I think in 69. But we're now talking about a building on King George Street. And the rumor goes that Ben-Gurion has a very important message to make to the Knesset. The place is completely packed. There's not any place to sit, according to people who were there and who kept diaries. And Ben-Gurion walks in and basically says, I'm here to announce that not long ago, Israeli security forces captured the highest-ranking living Nazi official, obviously Adolf Eichmann. He has been spirited out of Argentina. He is currently in Israel. By the way, he was in then what is now the Satay Hotel. Presumably, it's nicer now than it was then. Presumably, it was less expensive then than it is now. But in any event, and he's going to stand trial here. Now, Israelis obviously did not celebrate, but there was a deep sense of satisfaction, both in the Knesset chamber that day and among Israelis. Don't forget the percentage of Israeli society that had either lost people in it or walking around with numbers on their arms. I mean, we all know the story. Nobody celebrated the capture of Eichmann, but there was a deep-seated sense of great satisfaction that a mere 12 years after the creation of the state, Israel had changed the existential condition of what it meant to be a Jew. You could not kill Jews with impunity and live your life out in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. Those days were over. There was a deep sense of satisfaction here. It was much more complicated in America. Rank-and-file American Jews felt a similar sense of deep satisfaction. American Jewish leaders were actually incensed. And Deborah Lipstadt describes this very well in her book about the Eichmann trial, but I steal some of it. There's footnotes. but I put some of it in the book. By the way, you can understand, by the way, why, right? American Jews asked the following question. How many Israelis did Adolf Eichmann kill? Exactly 0, right? So therefore, by virtue of what? It's misamcha, right out of Sefer Shemot, right? Who appointed you? Who said you're the ones who should go? I mean, you represent the whole Jewish people? Now, it's not clear to me, by the way, who they thought would do it. Kind of like, B'nai B'rith with logistical support from Hadassah or something like that. I'm not 100% sure who was going to go there and get him. I don't know, the Rabbinical Assembly. Not entirely clear to me. But nonetheless, they were enraged. And Ben-Gurion was in turn equally enraged. And he said at the 25th Zionist Congress at the end of 1960, in December 1960, he said, American Judaism has become utterly irrelevant, and it is going to disappear into a sea of assimilation. I only point that out now because it's not just Big Bad Bibi who says things like that. It's the leftist, socialist, onesie-wearing, standing on his head, founding prime minister of the state of Israel, who said exactly the same thing. No, he wore this onesie kind of thing. I go into Baby Gap, because, we have granddaughters, and I'm happy to show you 800 videos down the road. But, I go into Baby Gap, they have, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, then I'm looking for, prime minister. But they don't seem to have it. Maybe it's in the real Gap, not the Baby Gap. But in any event, he was enraged, and I just point that out, that the rhetoric of Israeli prime ministers about American Jews is not new to Bibi. It's not new to the Likud. It is Israeli in its fundamental essence. Another story altogether. So if those are all the reasons that's not the divide, what is the reason? And I'm going to keep my eye very clearly on the clock here. I'll say it very quickly. American Judaism and Israeli Judaism have now become entirely different animals. They are just entirely different manifestations. Okay, I'll give you just a couple of examples. America is a fundamentally universalist enterprise. When in the course of human events, human, not Christian, not white, not European, human events, Israel's first sentence, Be'eretz Yisrael kama am ha'Yehudi. Nikuda. Bald eagle, menorah. Stars and stripes, which is also in Cuba's flag, in Togo's flag, and lots of different flags, as opposed to a flag that's in dialogue with a talit. In other words, everything about America is universalist, and the ultimate example of this is Emma Lazarus's poem, right at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty now, called The Great Colossus. Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry. And then she talks about your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That's who America was for. Huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And many of the people in this room who came from America have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents to whom America actually lived out that promise. It's very much in vogue now to talk about the way in which America has not lived out its promise. But for many of the people in this room, their families are evidence of the fact that many times America did fulfill its promise. Israel was never about huddled masses yearning to be free. Israel was about the law of return. Israel was about there can be no more ships on the open seas filled with hundreds of Jews that have nowhere to go. The Exodus, the Struma, the St. Louis, there's a gazillion different examples. Done. The United States is a liberal democracy meant to be a model of democracy that can be copied anywhere in the world, theoretically. And Thomas Jefferson believed that one day it would actually spread all over the world. And Israel is an ethnic democracy, has the functioning of a democracy, but in which one particular ethnicity is at its core. Not only demographically, but in terms of its very purpose. So the reason that American Jews, and I'll suffice with this, there's lots of other reasons given in the book, but I'm just going to suffice with this one basic point because I think it's the major one. When American Jews, for example, look at the nation-state law, then the headlines are, Israel is abandoning its democratic roots. But what was in the nation-state law that was not in the basic law of 1985? Which said that you can't be a political party running for the Knesset unless you publicly endorse the idea of Israel being a Jewish and democratic state. Now, America can never be a Christian and democratic state because that's anathema to the universalism that is America. Israel's particularism is fundamentally at odds with that. There are also completely different attitudes to history, to whether or not the public square should be filled with religious symbolism or not. I want to say one last thing about how I think this actually may be changing a tiny little bit. Somebody asked me outside, is there some optimism? Yeah, I think there's a cause for optimism, but there's no question that the world is darkening for the Jewish people. I mean, I think about that, I think there's no question. Not here. Actually, here, I think, despite everything that we love to worry about, and we make a, it's kind of our work to worry, right? The truth of the matter is that across the world, I mean, even as we're sitting here right now, I think, and it would be inappropriate of us not to mention the fact that as we're sitting here right now, there are thousands and thousands of Jews in New York protesting the rise in anti-Semitism. And if you watch the videos of stuff that's been captured on security cameras and so on and so forth, it is just absolutely chilling. There may be actually, though, a terrible silver lining in all of that. It is not that American Jews are going to suddenly become rabid Zionists and pick up their suitcases and come here. That's not the case. But it may be that the recognition that Jews everywhere outside the state of Israel will live forever with a certain kind of vulnerability, it may at least awaken a certain acceptance of the fundamental Zionist founding fathers' insight that the Jews needed a state where they would be freed of two things: the pressure to assimilate and the fear of anti-Semitism. Not that American Jews will endorse everything that Israel does, but ironically, the terrible things that we're witnessing now in America might actually soften the hard-edged opposition to so much of what Israel is, because American Jews will understand that things are not as different in America as from Europe as they once allowed themselves to believe. But fundamentally, the argument of the book is the American Jewish break with Israel is not about what Israel does, it's about what Israel is. Because America is so fundamentally universalist, a country that's as particularist as this is fundamentally, seems to American Jews not to be a real democracy, not to be a flourishing kind of a democracy. And therefore, I would argue the most important thing we can possibly do is have conversations not about how similar we are, but how different we are, not by accident, but by intent and because of our very purposes. America was meant to be a model of democracy that could be spread across the world. Israel was meant to be a country that would save the Jewish people. Both have been unbelievably successful, but that means, of course, that they are very different both in their purposes and the way they manifest themselves. We'll talk about it more later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel Gordis. Okay, next up, Annika Hönroth-Rothstein. Annika is a freelance journalist from Sweden. Her work has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Commentary, the Washington Examiner, Foreign Policy, among others. In particular, she's written some extraordinary reports from her recent visits to Iran and Venezuela, which I recommend you all Google and read. In both of those countries, as well as reporting on the political situation, she spent time with the Jewish communities there, and those visits provide the material for two of the chapters in her new book, which we'll hear about now, Exile: Portraits of the Jewish Diaspora. Annika Hönroth-Rothstein.
I'm proving my diaspora credentials by being severely overdressed to yet another Israeli event. So that's one thing. So other than that beautiful introduction, I'll say that I am what they call a woodland Jew, at least where I come from. I come from a very small Jewish diaspora community on the west coast of Sweden. And that is a huge part of why I wrote this book. Because I grew up with a sense of victimhood, yes, but also a sense that Jewishness was a problem that needed to be solved. I very often viewed my own Jewish identity and Jewish identity in general as something really problematic. But then I went on a trip, just by chance, to Iran. And it was just by chance, because I happened to be at a Rosh Hashanah dinner in Nov Tzion, of all places. And I was there visiting a lovely family who had met on the Temple Mount, by the way, which is a story for a different day. And the man in the family had family in Tehran. Some of his extended family lived in Tehran. And he spoke about the stories he had heard from that community, a place that he himself had never visited. And he said, oh, I so wish that I could know what that is like, what Jewish life is like today in Tehran. And I thought, hey, I have a Swedish passport. I can go wherever I want. It's the golden ticket. So I went. And that was how the idea of this book really came about. Because what I saw in Tehran was, of course, obviously highly problematic, and I'm sure you'll ask questions about it later, but it was also positive in a really surprising way. So what I'm going to do, because of course I visited 12 countries, and I wrote a book about it. And I want you to buy the book, which is out for January 14th, by the way. So I'll tell you about a couple of them, and about the great things and the more problematic things, and what I think are lessons to be learned from them. So we'll start with Iran, a community that is roughly the size of my own Swedish community, between 15 to 17,000 Jews. And it is, of course, by nature, a very, very religious community. Why? Because of Sharia law. Because you stay Orthodox. You don't intermarry because you can't by law. And on the face of that, that is, of course, only problematic, but there is also something very beautiful that I encountered, and that gave me hope for the Jewish people in Iran of all places. And that was that I recognized myself immediately and recognized my people immediately once I walked into the door of the first synagogue on Philistine Street, of all places, in Tehran. I went to shul because that's, the best way to get to know people, and that's what I did with every community that I visited throughout this book. The first thing I do is I go to shul, and of course, what happens at shul? Someone says, hey, you're new, and especially in Tehran, they can tell that you're new, and they invite you over for Shabbos or whatever, and suddenly you know everybody. And that's the very thing that happened. I walked into shul, not knowing anything really. With me, of course, because I'm a journalist and I went to Iran, I had a government minder, a very, very religious Muslim working for the regime in Iran. And he had to go to shul with me. But magically, because of course all shuls are Orthodox in Iran, there's something called a mechitza. Not close enough? Okay. There's something called a mechitza, which means that he can't come on that other side, which meant that I could ask the real questions to the women on the other side, and he wasn't allowed to listen in or even look at us. And as a religious Muslim, of course, he respected that rule. So I was able to have real conversations with Jews and ask real questions. And then at dinner, and Shabbos dinner, where he was, by the way, and where Jews made kiddush on real wine in front of this religious Muslim in the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's a great book. You should really buy it. It's very interesting, filled with stories like these. So I asked the, acceptable questions in front of him. But behind the mechitza, I learned something really important, which I'm going to start with the strength of the community of Iran. And that is its undying love for and unbreakable bond to Israel, of all places. Because there was one question that I was asked by every Jew I met in Iran, and that was, have you seen Jerusalem? Have you visited Jerusalem? Which is an amazing question, because you assume, we've all seen the news, we've all heard the reports from Iran, and what you see is, of course, anti-Zionism, the burning of the Israeli flag. We see the Jewish MP, who, of course, is friends with Ahmadinejad. We assume that this is a community that has been poisoned. But you understand that, of course, as in all of these places, all of these regimes, all of these oppressive states, there is an official image, and then there is reality. So the question that they asked me behind the mechitza was, have you been to Hebron? Have you been to the Kotel? Have you seen Jerusalem? What is it like? Do you have pictures? Do you have videos? Of course, I was smart enough to delete those before I went because I didn't know what I was getting myself into. But that was what we spoke about. And there was something amazing to me to meet the Jews there and to understand that we all speak the same language. And that trip was the reason that I went on my second trip, because I understood that there must be a lot of surprises out there in the Jewish world in the most unexpected places. Of course, I can't talk about Iran without mentioning the bad stuff. We all know the bad stuff. Being a Jew in Iran means that you have a lot more freedom than I do in a certain sense as a European Jew. Because in Tehran, you have at least 6 kosher butcheries. I have 0 in my entire country because it's illegal. You can walk around, of course, with a kippah if you're a man anywhere in Tehran. It's not an issue. You have at least 13 minyanim every day. You have a very, very active and very, very visible community. And very religious. No intermarriage. Again, huge problem where I come from. But of course, it is that way for a reason. It is Jewish life locked inside a golden cage. Because the reason that I received a visa to Iran in the first place is that they said yes, because we, have the biggest Jewish community outside of Israel. We protect our Jews. We love our Jews. We're good to the Jews. And that's, of course, why I was invited there. Because if, a single Jewish woman can be let in and walk freely around Tehran, how bad could it possibly be? So there was, of course, a sense of theatrics, North Korean style invitation, if you will. And not only are you locked in a cage in sort of a figurative sense, but it also in a literal one. Because, yes, officially, you are allowed to visit Israel, travel to Israel. You're allowed to get out of the country. But then you have to put up sometimes your house. If you have a shop, you have to put up your shop as collateral. Which means and often they only allow 1 or 2 people from one family visas at a time, meaning you don't want entire families to flee to Israel or outside of the country. This is, of course, done anyway, and I was told by the chief rabbi in Iran that they have a record number of agunot in Iran, and that's a huge issue because of this. And that tells you something, because at least in my mind, men don't leave their entire families for nothing. There must be an extraordinary level of desperation in order for that to happen. But with that said, the sense of community that I felt in Iran was second to none. Not only, of course, because they were very grateful to have me there, and as they said, I was fresh blood, and they asked, can you live here? Do you have a husband? We could really use you. You're very tall. So apart from that and the extraordinary food, there was something magical, and we've all felt it when we've been abroad, that when you walk into services, regardless of where you are or how far from home you are, you know those words, you know those songs. Yes, they might be sung a little bit differently, and sometimes, I can't find my way around a siddur if it's, a service very far from home. But there's a shorthand because we're all family. And it also means that you connect and you speak the truth to each other, and you invite each other home, and you take care of each other in a way that you wouldn't a stranger, because you're never a stranger when you're part of the Jewish family. And that was the takeaway more than the oppression, because we know that chains break, they actually do. Even if sometimes it takes 40, 50, 60 years, but chains eventually break. But the bond, the Jewish people's bond to Israel and to each other, hasn't. And that was the takeaway from the trip to Iran. And I thought, okay, if I feel this hopeful after having spent almost 10 years writing about really gloomy things in Europe, about anti-Semitism and how horrible it is to be a Jew and how difficult it is, I went to Iran, and not only did I feel more hopeful about being a Jew and about the Jewish people, but I also felt connected to Israel in a way that I had never done before, because of course I understood what it means to not be able to lean on the Jewish state for the first time. I've been, as I said, I grew up with a sense of victimhood, with a very strong connection to the Holocaust, with a very strong connection to all the things that hurt about being a Jew. But what I saw in Iran was what happens when you don't have a life raft. I call Israel my life raft all the time, because I have the luxury of complaining about it and then living in Sweden and then knowing that if something happens, God forbid, I'll just go. I take my passport, I drop everything, and I go. In Iran, they don't have that luxury, which of course means that you have to watch what you say. You have to watch what you do. You have to bow still. And this goes to what Danny was saying, that that is a victimhood, and that is a sense of Jewishness that I'm too young to have experienced, that I don't know a world where we didn't have Israel. But going to Iran, I could see what that world would be. And I understood what it means and what a luxury and a privilege it is for me to have that, because it gives me the privilege of being loud and complaining and being a strong Jew. And they don't have that luxury. So from Iran, I went to Jerba. Oh, I'm not checking the time. You'll stop me. Someone will yell. Okay, great. Left or, oh, okay. Uh, so from there, I went to the island of the Kohanim. I went to Jerba, Tunisia, mostly because I was fascinated about the story behind it. Again, it's a great book. I'll tell it there. Because I had heard about this magical island where almost half of the people there are Jews, and they're very Orthodox, and they live free Jewish life with their Muslim neighbors. And as a person who lives in a country with a lot of Muslim neighbors, where it doesn't work as well, I thought, let's see what this is about. So I went to Jerba, and long story short, because I have 5 minutes apparently, I fell in love. I fell in love not only with a beautiful, breathtaking place, but also with a place that seemed to have solved a very important question and mystery to me. How do you live alongside a majority Muslim population and do it well? Well, the answer is returning to the shtetl. And I don't say that in a bad way. I say that in a great way. Some of you might disagree. We'll discuss later. But what they've done is they built themselves a Jewish city where, you're in the Muslim part of Jerba, and of course you have your mosques and you have your regular Muslim life, and then you walk about 2.5 minutes, and then suddenly there are boys everywhere in black velvet kippot. They're playing soccer. There are highly traditionally clothed Jewish women. There is a Jewish life that I didn't know existed outside of the stories of grandparents. And I asked, I was, again, what did I do? I was there over Hanukkah, and I spent all of Hanukkah there, and I, of course, went to shul on the first day, and what happened? I was invited home not only for a meal, but I ended up living at the house of someone else who had 6 sisters, and it was the female floor on top, and then men stayed on the bottom floor. And it is traditional to a point where, I don't walk into super Orthodox areas here, so I had not known a life where I wasn't allowed to walk, 100 feet from a man. But that is the rule in Jerba. When you get engaged, then there's a year until marriage. And then when you meet in the street, this is, again, a tiny island. You're not supposed to make eye contact with your fiance. And I asked the people I was staying with, I said, this is absurd. This is your fiance right over there. I can almost touch him. I wouldn't, but I could. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, one time you look them in the eye, and then you have a pregnant bride under the chuppah. And this is also the reason, by the way, why the people, at least the people from the family I spoke to, didn't want to make Aliyah. I said, you're very religious, you live here, you have all these Muslim neighbors. Wouldn't it be easier to live in Israel? And they said, no, far too secular country. I'm very scared that my children would become secular if they moved to Israel because there are too many choices. And I said, well, don't people, everyone has someone in the family who went off the derech or, whatever. And they said, no, that doesn't happen here. And I said, well, that's just not possible. It happens everywhere. And they said, oh, well, we had this one guy who chose not to be a Jew, but he lives in Tunis now, meaning he went off the derech, but it means he didn't want to be a Jew anymore. This is how close-knit that community is. And what was fascinating to me was I asked them, how does that work? Living 1 minute? Okay. With all of these Muslim neighbors and seemingly having it, under control. It's a functioning relationship. You live on top of each other, basically. They're perhaps not close family friends, but they work together and they're courteous. And they said, well, because our chief rabbi told us where the line is. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, we keep to ourselves, but we mix, but to a certain degree. That this is a strangers and neighbors type thing. That we don't give away, we don't assimilate. We don't eat dinner at each other's houses, but we will say hello. We will work together, but we will not intermingle. And yes, perhaps on the face of it, this seems like a bad thing. To me, this seemed almost like a solution, because what I understood is these are highly religious Muslims living next to highly religious Jews, and it is much easier than it is for half-assimilated Swedish Jews in a very secular country to live next to highly religious Muslims. Because not only, one of the things I found during this research was that religion begets religion. and that it is much easier for a very religious person to understand a very religious person. Yes, you disagree on 5%, but you really understand each other on 95%. And there is a level of respect, which also, to a certain extent, is true in other Muslim countries as well. And no, I'm not disregarding. I know I always get this, oh, you're whitewashing what has happened in Arab life. I'm not doing that. But what I am saying is that I saw this one beautiful example of Muslim and Jews living next to each other, but not intermingling. And that is my defense of a return to the shtetl. I was supposed to talk about 3 countries. I guess that's not happening. It's fascinating by the book. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Well, you'll get a chance to speak about a 3rd country and maybe others as well in the Q&A. Okay, finally, it's my great pleasure to welcome Shmuel Rosner, fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and the non-fiction editor for Israel's largest publishing house, Kinneret Zimora B'Tandavir. Shmuel is senior political editor for the Jewish Journal. He has a weekly column for the International New York Times and for Ma'ariv here in Israel. Previously a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, was also chief US correspondent, head of the news division, and head of the features division for Haaretz. His previous book, Shtetl Bagel Baseball on the Wonderful, Dreadful State of American Jews, was published in Israel and was a bestseller. And he also has a fabulous podcast, which I can personally recommend, having recently started listening to it. So, Shmuel Rosner, please join us.
Next time they ask me to speak after 2 wonderful speakers, I'll say no. I'd also like to say that if you come to Israel, the last place you'd go to find a Jew is the synagogue. And I'd like to begin well, I'll say something else. You need to buy Annika's book starting January 15th. No? 14, okay. And you already bought Daniel's, which leaves you only 10 days to buy my own book. I'm going to try and take some of the things that were said before me and pick it from there. My book and my study is mostly about Israel. So I'm not going to talk much about diaspora Jews, about American Jews or other Jews. I'm going to speak about Israelis, but many of the things that I will say will echo some of the things that were said before me, and will have implications for the relations Israeli Jews have with Jews in other places. My study and the book was not done only by me. It was done in collaboration with a professor in Tel Aviv University named Camille Fuchs. You might know him from television as a very famous pollster on Israeli politics. My wife now calls him the man who got it right twice. He will have his next opportunity on March 2nd, if I'm not mistaken. He's not looking forward to it. I want to begin my story by telling you a story about Professor Fuchs. When we started our research, and our research is meant to understand Israeli Jewish society in a better way, we decided after some consultation that our main focus will be not views of Jews, but rather practice of Jews. We are going to try and look at what people are doing rather than what they are thinking or pretending to think, because we assume that actions speak louder than words. So we started looking at the calendar and looking at different events, holidays, dates on which we have questions. And we started with Rosh Hashanah. So we had many questions we wanted to ask about Rosh Hashanah. And what comes after Rosh Hashanah? Tzom Gedalia. We wanted to know if people remembered that there is a Tzom Gedalia after Rosh Hashanah. Some people do. Mostly religious Israelis, non-religious Israelis tend to forget Tzom Gedalia. So we asked a couple questions about Tzom Gedalia and about Yom Kippur. and all other dates you can imagine on the calendar. And when we reached Hanukkah, of course, Hanukkah is an important holiday, just ended a few days ago. That's why I'm telling you the story about Hanukkah. We had many questions about Hanukkah. Do you eat latkes? Do you eat donuts? Do you give gel to your children? Do you go to a festival with your children? Do you travel abroad or in Israel? And of course, we wanted to know if people are lighting candles on Hanukkah. So we had two types of questions about candles. One, do you light candles? Or two options for people who light candles. Do you light candles every day, 8 days in a row? Or do you light candles some days? And of course, the other option is, I don't like candles. And we asked the questions and got all the data. Our research is data-based research. We did a vast survey, one of the largest ever done in Israel, with more than 400 questions, more than 3,000 Israelis, Jewish Israelis surveyed. And we got all the answers, and we started looking at the numbers, and we got to Hanukkah and looked at the lighting of candles, and we had a problem. Because when we took the numbers of people who light every day and those who light some days, we got 115% of Jews lighting candles. And that's, well, we thought it was impossible. I could let it pass, but Camille is a mathematician. So for him, this was a no-go. So we started looking at the numbers and looking at them line by line. Okay, who said this, who said that, and we realized that some people, just in case, to make sure we understand that they truly, really light candles every day of the week, they marked both options, every day and some days. And when we, after cleaning up the data to get to the real number, we got to 100%. 3,004 Jews surveyed, 3,004 Jews lighting candles. And I said, well, Professor Fuchs, that's impossible. We must find someone. There must be a mistake. So again, we went back to the data and looked line by line at each person. And after the 3,004th person, I said, well, I give up. It's 100%. And Professor Fuchs looked at me somewhat embarrassingly and said, well, there's me. The happy ending of this story is that last week or the week before, Camille called me on Wednesday, and he said, guess where I was last night? I said, what did you do last night? He said, I was at a friend's house, and they let me light the candles. So this year, I can guarantee that there is indeed 100% of Jews in Israel who lit candles on Hanukkah, unless you tell me otherwise. Why is this story important? This story is important not because Hanukkah is so important or lighting candles is so important or because it's important for me that all Jews light candles. It's important because it tells you something about Israel. It tells you that lighting candles in Israel is something that everybody does and that there's really no other option. You cannot, well, you can, but it's really inconvenient to be a Jew in Israel and not to light candles on Hanukkah. There is lighting of candles at workplaces and at friends' houses, and you go to family gatherings, and you have children at home, and they might want you to light candles. So when we look at Jewish Israelis, and here I can compare them to American Jews. We have this in the book. When you ask American Jews, which are the three most important holidays, Hanukkah, for most of them, is one of them, along with Yom Kippur and Pesach. Okay, so they consider Hanukkah to be one of the most important holidays because of the obvious reasons, the winter season, the winter holidays, etc. In Israel, when you ask Israeli Jews if Hanukkah is a very important holiday, most of them say, oh, well, no, it's a second-tier holiday, not one of the most important holidays. And yet, when you compare the number of Israeli Jews lighting candles on Hanukkah to the number or the percentage of American Jews lighting candles in Hanukkah, you easily discover that Israelis light more candles than American Jews. The holiday might not be as important, but we all light candles. Why do we light candles? Here I'm going to pick it up where Daniel ended his conversation. Zionism had two items, two main features when it started. It meant to save the Jews from physical harm or annihilation. Somewhat succeeded, not soon enough. And it meant to save Judaism from disappearing in this era of modernity, secularization, assimilation, etc. I cannot tell you for sure if Israel is going to succeed with the first item. We have Iran, we have many enemies, we have strong military, we are working on it. But as for the cultural part, as for the cultural preservation of Jews, I can tell you with some certainty that Zionism is a success story. Jews in Israel, religious and non-religious, traditional and secular, atheist and believers, they all practice a lot of Judaism. Many of them don't even know that they do, or don't even stop to consider the fact that they do. But when you hand them a questionnaire, at the beginning of which you ask them, do you practice Judaism? And they'll say, not much. Or in some cases, not at all. And then you ask them the next 400 questions, you discover that not at all in Israel means yes to 183 questions. Because if it's Seder night, and you don't go to a Seder, you will literally sit alone in the dark. There's nothing else to do in Israel, so everybody goes. For Seder night, we got 98% of Jews who said, yes, we regularly go to a Seder. For Rosh Hashanah Eve, okay, another important holiday, again, 98% of Jews say, yes, we do hold a holiday meal with our family and friends on Rosh Hashanah Eve. Many of them will also dip apple in honey. Some of them will make kiddush. Of course, we don't have the same level of observance by all Jews of all practices. But when you combine all the data, you realize that Israel is in many ways like a circus with a safety net. Okay, you have the acrobats. They all fly up in the air. Some of them fly higher. Some of them are not as skilled. But even those of them who fall off the whatever equipment that they have in the circus, they don't hit the ground. The safety net keeps them from... There are no Jews, or very few Jews in Israel who really practice no Judaism. Because it's impossible. Because one of the things that Israel created, and in this way it is meeting the challenge of modernity and assimilation and secularization, is to create an atmosphere, an environment in which it's almost impossible not to be Jewish and practice some sort of Jewish culture and tradition. And be aware that I keep using the word tradition and culture. I deliberately eliminate the word religion. There are religious people in Israel, about 32% of the Jewish population. These are religious people, so they practice a higher level of tradition. They keep more mitzvot, they observe it. They go by the halacha or the Shulchan Aruch, many of them. That's fine, that's 30% of the population. I'm not talking about these people. We know about these people. I'm talking about the other 70%. The 70%, many of which say, no, we don't observe much Judaism. But then you say, okay, what do you do on Purim? Well, of course, I go to a party. My children dress up for Purim. What do you do in Hanukkah? Oh, I light candles. What do you do in Shavuot? Okay, Shavuot is an example that I really like because it's a, who cares about Shavuot? It's one day. If you live in Pensacola, Florida, and you don't much care about Judaism, you can let Shavuot come and go without you even knowing it happened. If you didn't keep in mind to remember the exact day in which Shavuot happens, you will not know about it coming and going. Well, in Israel, as secular as you might be, you hate the Torah, you dislike Moses, no matter what you think about Shavuot, 10 days before the holiday, you just want to watch some lousy TV show, and there's a commercial, and it's cheesecakes. And the next commercial will be another one about cheesecakes. And you'll go to a supermarket, and they'll just hand you cheesecakes, whether you want them or not. Which, again, if you think, this evening is about Israel-diaspora relations, when we begin to think about the experience of Jews in Israel compared to the experience of Jews in all other places, Israel is something new and unique. For 2,000 years, and in all other places around the world, to be Jewish, you had to make an effort. You had to be conscious about it. You had to live within a community. You had to worry about where you'll find kosher food. You'll have to think about your neighbors and anti-Semitism and whether you want to put the menorah on the window or just hide it behind. That's my cue. Or hide it somewhere. There was always effort involved in being Jewish. There is still effort involved in being Jewish in America. I have great appreciation for Jews who manage to keep strong Jewish identity in America because I know it's very hard. That's why it often does not succeed. In Israel, it's easy. This is the first place in a very long time in which being Jewish is the easy choice. It's, in the book we call it effortless Judaism. Israeli Judaism, it's effortless Judaism, which makes it unique and different than everything else that we know. And I agree with Dr. Gordis that all the differences that we see and all the gaps and the divides that we see between Israel and diaspora Jews are first and foremost because of the cultural differences that separates these two great communities. And I do not see any prospect for these two communities to become more alike. They might find other remedies by which to come closer. But for these two cultures to be alike is really impossible because circumstances are different, cultures must be different. Thank you.
This works good. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions. Firstly, I'm just going to ask if any of you wanted to comment on anything that had been said by one of the other speakers. A burning desire to comment. Any of? Okay. So three great introductory speeches. I hope they've all encourage you all to go out and buy the books if you've not already done so. As we've said, Danny Gordis' and Shmuel Rosner's are on sale outside. I believe Annika might have a few, but it's going to be on sale in in a couple of weeks, and you can pre-order from Amazon, I believe. Yes? Okay. We've heard about the differences in the United States, and here the very universal, the universal message of America from its very founding, and the way that the Jewish community there reflects that, and the way that compares to what the specific particularist Jewish project here in Israel. Shmuel Rosen touched on that as well, and also the uniqueness of the Jewishness that's developed here, which is practiced even by those not religious in a way that I think is not and perhaps cannot be the case for non-religious Jews outside of Israel. And then Annika's presentation, where at least the two examples that you gave, talk very much about communities where religious Judaism is keeping the community together, and you saw that as a very positive thing. And I think, and I'm sure in the book there's other examples of other communities. So let's open the floor to questions. Please stick up your hand, and please let the comment end with a question mark and not be too long. Yes, sir, at the front here.
Is it correct to compare President Trump to Cyrus?
You can compare anything to anything, so yes.
Did everyone hear that question? Okay. So is it correct to compare President Trump to Cyrus? Anyone want to take that?
I don't know what that question means, actually. You can compare an apple to an airplane. I mean, it's just that you can compare anything. Is President Trump going to be perceived in history as a great liberator of the Jewish people? No.
Okay. Either of you want to comment on that question, or should we go to another question? Okay. Yeah, I think that politics, in particular Trump and Bibi, are issues which probably everyone in this room has a lot to say about. If possible, can we keep away from those? Because I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about which are nothing to do with either Donald Trump or Bibi Netanyahu. Okay, so hands up, yes. Professor Steinberg in the corner there.
I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic. First of all, 3 excellent presentations. I did books, all of them. You put my book up to the I'm going to be pessimistic. There are, 7.5 million Jews in Israel now, roughly? There are roughly similar numbers in the United States. Israel is about 45% of the total Jewish population. Most of the Jewish diasporas are assimilated. I wonder if you'll be able to do a trip like that in 20, 30, or certainly 40 years, generation. There's a real crisis of assimilation of all the other defective. And one of the Ben-Gurion's principles in the whole Palestine and everything else that was done, I think every Israeli has seen the strategic importance of particularly having the American Jewish community being supportive of Israel. So I'm wondering whether we are now at some sort of a peak moment where the future looks pretty grim unless there are fundamental changes. And I'll put a little bit of a sting to that question and say all of the controversies, all of the issues on terms of the Kotel framework and the issue of conversion, the chief rabbinate, the sense that I get when I do my tours in the United States, if it doesn't take a while, is of alienation. We don't have generation. Do you agree that we are? This is a question that we won't have much generation in 20 years that will be able to present that broader picture.
Yeah, okay. I felt like the first part of that question might have been directed to me, so I'll answer it. I think I'll be able to do that trip, those trips. Maybe not all of them, but again, by the book, to find out which aren't going to make it. In 20 years, one example I'll take is Siberia. I went to Irkutsk, where there are now returning Jews, and by returning I mean Jews who are either finding out or now admitting and openly claiming their Jewishness, coming to Chabad, being circumcised, coming into the fold. There is, to quote one of my favorite bands, there is a light that never goes out. And And that is the Jewish spirit. And I'm usually the doom and gloom girl, always, everywhere. I have been for 10 years. But this book has really, I don't know, ignited hope in me for the Jewish people, because I've stayed away from Europe and America because I feel like we talk that to death, and we're also heard to death. I went to these places like Cuba and Iran and Venezuela and Siberia and all over, these places that we rarely speak about, and what you find there is life. You find the Jewish spirit in places that, you know, we'd understand if they threw in the towel. We'd understand if they just gave it up, but we don't do that. And I think we as a people have proven that that's just not something we do. Yes, there are ebbs and flows in the Jewish existence, but, you know, part of the basic thesis of my book was, why do we make it? Because we always do. We shouldn't, but we do. And I can't help but be hopeful. I mean, some of us, you know, give thanks to God for that, and others, you know, you can look at the numbers and look at, there are factors that, you know, there are factors such as adherence to Torah, there are factors such as living close together, food, all of these different things, but we do make it, although we shouldn't. So yeah, my retirement plan is, I'll do this again in 40 years. This is my thing now.
Well, I for sure won't be doing anything in 40 years, but I hope. But in any event, look, I think you know the answer to this very well. The difference between, and you answered the question yourself, even the second half, I think, by saying that we survive as a people. And that's the critical word. American Judaism tried to redefine itself not as a nation, but as a religion, and it's a failed experiment. It's an experiment that goes way back to 1885 with the Pittsburgh Platform, in which they said that we no longer see ourselves as a nation, but only as a religion, and therefore we seek no return to Zion, etc. You know all of this better than anybody else here. But I think one of the things that it's fair to say is that the experiment of recreating American Judaism as a religion, think of, who wrote Protestant Catholic Jew? Will Herberg, right? So Will Herberg's book in the late 1950s, early 1960s was an attempt to kind of try to portray Judaism as being part of the mosaic of American, not peoples, but of American religions. That's a failed experiment. I think we understand that. And the difference between orthodoxy on the one hand, and again, let's not be overly rigid here, but the difference between traditional, halachically oriented Jews and those who are not is actually not how many mitzvot they do. I mean, that is actually obviously part of the picture, but I don't believe that that's the fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is not so much Shavuot, because I'm lactose intolerant, so I just kind of wait for it to be over, but the fundamental difference is Tisha B'Av. Right? Do you actually mourn on Tisha B'Av or do you not? And those people who do have a sense of a brokenheartedness, which is not about religion, but it's about peoplehood. It's about, there is a sense in Jewish life in all of the places that you spoke about, I'm guessing, where they are part of a people. What America tried to do was to try to create an American people, which in order for the Jews to be part of the American people, they couldn't be part of another people. And Woodrow Wilson said this explicitly in 1915. He said, if you're American, if you're Austrian American or Italian American or Spanish American, etc., then, again, not PC language, but he said, you are no worthy son to stand under the stars and stripes. That's 1915. 1917 is the Balfour Declaration. We here like to complain about how, quote unquote, little American Jews did back then. The truth of the matter is that given what Wilson had said in 1915 and the impossible predicament that Balfour put them in 1917, what's really extraordinary is how much they have done. They've built an extraordinary apparatus of amazing institutions that are overwhelmingly supportive of Israel, even with all of the attrition and all of that, in an environment in which it was always edgy to be part of another people. And the way that many people tried to sort of finesse that was to talk about the religion and not the people. That, I think, is not going to survive. I think we know that outside the religious community in America, the intermarriage rate is north of 70%, 70%. Right? Of the children of those 70% families, 80% do not define themselves as Jews. Right? Forget the ones who say that they're Jews but don't do a thing about it and don't know anything about it. In other words, the numbers, you don't have to be Camille Fuchs here. In other words, you don't have to be a statistician. The numbers are very clear, it can't survive. So what I think we're going to see is over the course of time, and Sergio de la Pergola, who is one of Israel's most important demographers, believes that by 2048, if I'm not mistaken, 100 years after, so it's about 28 years from now, there's going to be, he says, 10.6 million Jews in Israel and 5.3 million Jews in America. That's his prediction. It'll be exactly 2x. And so that at that point, Ben-Gurion will have been right and Blaustein will have been wrong. The center of gravity will clearly have moved to here. It's unlikely that the non-nationalist definitions of Judaism can survive. Those that are more nationalist probably will survive. I want to make one last quick point about this, which I do very hesitantly, because I don't want it to be taken out of context, but I think we ought to be thinking about what's going on in America tonight. So on my way over, I was texting. I was also driving, but I was at a red light. And I was talking to a friend who's there. And he said, it's amazing, there's so many people, and he sent me pictures on WhatsApp and this and that. And I texted him back, are there any Haredim there? Basically not. A few. A Chabad guy doing fill-in thing on the side, of course, that they have on Mars, right? So that's not, but basically not. And I think that's actually very interesting. Why not? Why not? And I'll tell you why. This is not meant to be critical of anybody in any way. The Haredim were the last people to come to America, the last Jews to come to America. They didn't come to America because they wanted to. They came to America because Europe was aflame. They didn't come to America because they believed that America was fundamentally going to be different. They came to America. It was the only place to go. The rest of American Judaism, the liberal 80% of American Jews, are in shock now because what is happening has upended their faith in the goodness of America, a faith that the Haredim never ever had in the first place. Now, how does that manifest itself? And again, I want to make very clear this is not critical of anyone. The Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, from what I am told as of this Shabbat, has not yet reopened. It's become a museum of sorts about tolerance and so on and so forth. Perfectly fine. In Monsey, they had a Malava Malka in the same exact house that night. Why? Because in Monsey, in that national world of Jewish experience, you expect this. It is part of the Jewish story. It's the story of Tisha B'Av. It's the story of all of the stanzas of Ma'oz Tzur. It's the story of the people that we tell. It's horrifying, but it's not surprising. When you recreate Judaism as a religion and separate it from peoplehood, then all of a sudden the resurgence of anti-Semitism makes absolutely no sense because your values and their values are fundamentally the same, so what are they attacking you for? So I actually agree with Professor Steinberg. I think that the likelihood that the non-nationalist versions of Judaism can survive is a very small likelihood. I don't think anybody here ought to take any joy in anything about any part of the Jewish people disappearing. But I think the likelihood is that it is going to wither away. And what we are going to have in common, ironically, secular Israelis are going to have much more in common with the Haredim in Monsey because they are both highly national versions of Judaism, and neither is surprised that they have perpetual enemies.
Shmuel?
Yes, I'd like to take this thread and pull it a little further by talking about Tisha B'Av. You mentioned Tisha B'Av as an interesting example of the difference between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. And I have... I'll start with a friend. I have a colleague of mine at the Jewish People Policy Institute, a young colleague of mine. His name is Noah. He came from Canada, made Aliyah about 10 years ago. And 2 or 3 years ago, when we just started our study together, and he's the third wheel supporting Camille and myself in this study of Israeli Judaism, I asked him, Noah, why did you come to Israel? And his answer, tongue-in-cheek, but also serious, I thought was a wonderful answer. He said, I came to Israel so I can eat non-kosher food. And And I'm reminded of this when I think about Tisha B'Av, because Tisha B'Av is exactly the same place. Most Israeli Jews don't care one iota about Tisha B'Av. It's not an important day here in Israel. It's important for those for which it's important, and it's basically the Orthodox community. When you take the numbers of people who fast on Tisha B'Av or feel sad on Tisha B'Av, and we asked about 7 or 8 questions about Tisha B'Av, those who go to the Kotel, those who, all kinds of things about Tisha B'Av, you find that almost 90-something% of those who preserve some sense of importance, attribute some importance to Tisha B'Av, are Orthodox in habit and practice. So for most Israelis, Tisha B'Av is not important. So, okay, so how can you take this finding and make it compatible with the argument that you make? It's exactly compatible. In Israel, you don't have to keep Tisha B'Av to retain your sense of national Judaism. You can be national without, we don't need Tisha B'Av. We rebuilt this place, we rebuilt Jerusalem, we no longer need Tisha B'Av. If you want to be national and live someplace else, you still need to preserve Tisha B'Av. Again, one of the things, one of the examples of the divide that is cultural in essence and not political.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, Lisa.
I'm curious what you think the impact of current census in America
Okay, who? Annika.
I think that hardship is good. Oh, I didn't expect that. Because part of, I'll just say, if I did not grow up where I grew up, I would probably not be the least bit observant. Because pressure makes diamonds. And I think that part of, I'm not saying, I make a lot of arguments pro and against this mentality or that hardship creates your Jewish identity, but I think it does. I also think it reminds you of freedom, and religious freedom and religious observance is a muscle that you have to flex. It's a right that you have to use, meaning that it reminds people who may be off the derech or maybe never saw it to begin with, to get on it, or go to shul, or engage with your community, or have some other way of engaging Jewishly. Because it reminds you that people hate you. And, at least in my case, that was my road in to Jewish observance, was realizing that it doesn't matter how much of my Jewishness I peel off, they will still hate me. It doesn't matter if I try to look less Jewish, if I'm not, going to shul or seen with other Jews. It doesn't matter. In my case, at least, it didn't, and I don't think it does in most cases. They hate you because of the essence of what you are. So my decision was to become much more of that, because rather a strong Jew and be hated than be a weak, embarrassed Jew and be hated. And I think that we will see an uptick in America because people are reminded, oh yeah, it matters. It still matters. And sometimes, being the same isn't necessarily the best thing.
I don't look Jew at all, so they would never confuse me for a Jew. Why are you laughing? I'll give you the answer of I usually prefer data-based answers on such matters. So I have an easy answer on anti-Semitism. When when anti-Semitism goes up, Jews react in one of two ways. Those for which Judaism is at least somewhat important tend to strengthen then their identity. Those for which Judaism is not important tend to lower, we call it lower their Jewish profile. So for example, if it might be even slightly dangerous or awkward to put a menorah on your window on Hanukkah, if you are a proud Jew and it's important for you, you'll do it anyhow, or at least light it inside the home. If you don't care as much for this thing, you'll just skip this year. And you'll skip synagogue on Yom Kippur because there might be an attack and it's dangerous. And this will be your response. Now, referring to the previous question, since we know that in many Jewish communities today, the Jewish profile of Jews is relatively low anyhow, and Judaism ceased to be a daily practice or having high importance for these Jews, we should expect that the more anti-Semitism we see in the United States, the strong parts of the community, the engaged parts, will unite and become more robust. But many Jews will just disappear and will be off the radar.
I actually agree with that completely. The only thing that I'll add is what we're seeing in America now is the latest version of anti-Semitism. It's not that it was dormant for a very long time. Obviously, it was Father Coughlin and all that way back when. But much more recently, what's been happening on campus and masquerading as anti-Israel is really just anti-Semitism. And the campus in America has been the great wasteland of Jewish identity already for a number of years. That's long before Pittsburgh, long before Poway, long before Muncie, long before any of this. And that's exactly where we see exactly what Shmuel is talking about. You have small nuclei of Jews who get more and more and more involved. But for many American, quote unquote, liberal Jews or progressive Jews or millennials, or they're not all the same term, but they often overlap. Their real religion, in terms of the values that which they're deeply committed to, that transcend themselves, are the values of universalism and progressivism and so on and so forth. When those values are portrayed by the world in which they live as being at odds with being a Jew, we see over and over and over again that unfortunately it's easier to jettison that. So I think Shmuel's right. We're going to see a strengthening of the nucleus. We're going to see kind of a dissipation or an erosion of what's on the outside. And how exactly it plays out, of course, depends on how this actually plays out in the States in general, which nobody knows.
Does anyone have a question that isn't about? I'm not saying this just because I'm British. Does anyone have a question that isn't about America? I want to just. We can return to America. We can return to America. It's the biggest community. I'm not under any illusions as to its importance. But yes, sir, with his hand up and black top. Yes. That's okay. I mean, if anyone, that's quite a political.
I'll give a factual answer. Okay. There is a slight majority of Jews in Israel who think that supporting settlements is a Jewish value. Okay, not a great majority, but slightly more than 50%, which means that they attribute. Again, they see it as part of their Jewishness. It's not about politics, security. It's integral to their sense of Jewishness. So in some way, yes, the settlements, and again, we can go into detail, are these distant settlements, or in general, settling the land is something that Jewish Israelis care about. They see it as value. They see the geography of this place as a meaningful part of their Jewish identity, and they don't stop. They don't say, okay, and our identity stops at the 67 green line.
Thank you. Yes, the lady in the front here.
My question is for everyone, but especially for I was listening to what you were saying with a lot of interest about these communities, but I wonder whether for those Jews, in a way, it's actually easier because they're either part of their religious community or they're nothing. They don't have the choices that European Jews or American Jews or even Scandinavian Jews have, where you get this thing where it's suddenly easier to do a bit less and a bit less, and then, as the speaker just said, if there's anti-Semitism, then some of them will go beneath the radar. So, in a way, these Jews that you've met, in a way, they're actually in that there's this cohesion in a community. You said
Did everyone hear that question? Yeah, very quickly. If the communities that Annika was reporting on in her book actually have an easier task in many ways than Jews in the United States and bigger communities in Europe, because they don't really have the choice other than to be in their sort of secluded communities.
Yes. One of my very few yes or no answers. Yeah, I would say so. This is why one of the conclusions in my book, speaking about how do we grow strong communities, or rather, what is it that makes communities strong? I wasn't kidding about the shtetl. Like that's an actual thing that I recommend. Because when this becomes a binary choice, yes, it is easier. It's a lot more difficult for those who do leave. I will say that is a very dramatic thing that should not be underestimated for those who do for whatever reason. But yes. Yeah, I would say for me, and I mentioned it in the book several times, that there were places, especially Jerba, that were very difficult to leave emotionally. Because, of course, coming from where I come from, I've never truly experienced, because here you have a variety of choices in Israel as well. I spent a lot of time here, but there's a variety of ways to live your Jewish life and to express your Jewishness. But in Jerba, I had never experienced the feeling of community in that way and belonging, where everybody is truly your family, and going back to, you live, defensively, like this. It's like a Jewish life is always a little bit, your neck is sore pretty much all the time from just crouching. So it was emotionally difficult to leave some of these communities because it was such a beautiful expression. I would also just want to add, because we talk so much about the diaspora and how it's doing and will it die. I think just the question, I'm not going to answer it, but everyone should ask themselves, do we care about the diaspora surviving or not? Is it important to us? Because for me, yes, some of these communities I visited are very small. And it becomes this very tachlis discussion about, will it survive? And, no, go to Israel, make aliyah. And as a diaspora Jew, I'm somewhat annoyed because everyone, when I say, life is difficult, and they said, well, make aliyah or be quiet. But some of these places, or rather most of these places, have extraordinary expressions of Jewish heritage and culture. And I really feel very strongly about their survival now, seeing things in Iran and in Russia, and it's unique Jewish culture. And I know that as many different communities there are here in Israel, people do blend together, and it becomes an Israeli identity. And I do think we need to decide as people, and Israel, I think, needs to decide, is this a priority? And if it is, are the people in charge, do they understand what it takes? Are they speaking to these communities and asking, what do you need to stay Jewish? What do you need to have Jewish grandchildren one day, God willing? So I think that's another question that I'll just put out there, that do we care at all?
Okay, do either of you want to comment on that? Okay. Yes, the gentleman there with the glasses.
Not just the national but the idea that Jewish people and Judaism itself is very particular has been emphasized. But I was wondering, it would seem that both within Zionism had that aspect of cultural Zionism a little bit more universalistic, and within Judaism itself as a Or Goyim, that has an ultimate reason to continue to be Jewish, which has nothing to do with Judaism or the Jews themselves, but rather the entirety of the human race. If that doesn't mean that within Israel itself,
question. Who would like to take that?
That's an excellent question. I don't know what it'll do to the American piece. I'll just dodge that for a sec, or completely. What I do think is really, what you're pointing to is something very important about Israel. I think one of the things that we should look at is, you know, if Ben Gurion kept a little to-do list by the side of his bed in the 1950s, then basically everything that was on it has been ticked off. Not peace, but everything else that Ben Gurion could have possibly had on his to-do list of things to accomplish for the state, every single thing has been accomplished, and much more and far beyond that. The question really is, what's Zionism now at the beginning, or now in the second fifth of the 21st century? And I think the challenge is exactly what you're pointing to. In other words, can we actually now begin to have a conversation inside this country in which the values of Jewishness in its robust form actually begin to infuse the way in which we speak of ourselves as Jews and Zionists here, and in which we relate to people outside the world, outside Israel, in the Jewish community as well. And there's actually, unfortunately, there's a few lone voices, but you would not look to the office of the rabbinate for that voice, and you would not look to most Israeli political leaders as that voice. And I think that's really the great challenge of Zionism 2020 heading onwards, is can we actually recapture the nuance that you're talking about? The one last thing that I'll say is I am a big believer that you're 1,000% right, that we definitely want the diaspora to succeed and to flourish, among many other reasons, because that's where the exchange of ideas actually becomes critically important. Part of what Israel has to teach American Jews, I apologize for going back to America, it's a fine country you come from, but part of the challenge part of what Israel has to offer to American Jews, for example, is the indispensable nature of a Jewish living language for the perpetuation of Jewish identity, which Americans chose not to have, and I think they're paying the price for it. Part of what Israel shows is what happens when you take young people at a pivotal age in their life and say you're going to devote X number of years to something that's more important than yourself, and what does that do to their sense of identity, and so on and so forth. There's a lot that Israel has to teach American Jews about what's worked here. But American Jews, because precisely of that universal world in which they live and breathe, actually have a tremendous amount to remind Israelis of the danger of a narrow ethnocentrism which could grow here, and we see pockets of it here and there, we always have. And I think that actually, precisely because your point's so important, we actually do want the diaspora very much to survive, not because we need their votes in the UN or because we need American military support. All those things are important, but precisely because they have different voices about what Jewishness is and could be and ought to be, that could actually enrich our own conversation here.
Okay, we're going to move to another question. Yes, madam.
Well, I'm part of Hamas, yes. So. Okay. I was born in Sweden, by the way.
And me in Gaza. So, yeah. Swedish born and bred. I have a Swedish accent. I just don't use it. Only when I get into trouble in Israel, because it's very endearing from what I've heard. So, but there you go.
I was born in Baltimore to New York parents, so God is good, and I got neither accent. In all seriousness, I actually use the term occupation because that's the word that's used in the international discourse. I'm not taking a political stand one way or the other. And I actually felt this mostly with the History of Israel book. I had to make a very big choice. Do you use the word occupation, do you not? And I say this without no tongue in cheek. If you don't use the word occupation, then everybody who is to the left of a certain line looks at the book, does a search on Amazon, look inside. I'm not kidding. Look inside, occupation, not there. It's one of those books, done. So if you actually want to speak to people who use the language that appears in all of the international press, both the press that is supportive of Israel and the press that is not. The Wall Street Journal, which is very supportive of Israel, talks about the occupation all the time, and so on and so forth. I just chose to use the international nomenclature, and because that's the way that I write, that's the way that I talk. And I am not a member of Hamas.
Okay, the lady there had a hand up for a while. Yes.
Hope it's not a question about my accent.
Or if you're a member of Hamas.
The answer is, is yes and no. What we found, and what you see in Israel in terms of trends when it comes to religiosity level is basically a race between two competing trends. The religious people have more children, but some of their children will become more secular. So the question is always whether the number of children is higher than the number of people moving from religiosity to secularity. The society as a whole moves from religiosity to secularity. But since religious people have so much more children, their numbers are not declining. In fact, the number of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel is growing. The number of Orthodox, Zionist Orthodox, Dati Leumi in Israel is basically static. How can it be static when they have so many children? Because about a third, in some cases half of their children do not remain within the religious camp. So these are the demographic trends. More children for religious people, but society moving, this whole, we have this debate in Israel about Hadata and Chilun and which way Israel is going. We should know that when we look at generational changes, we see that younger people tend to be more secular. But again, because of the high number of religious children, it is not reflected in the overall picture of Israel.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So let's keep the question short, and I'm also going to ask my panel here to keep the answer short as well. So, gentleman there in the corner first.
As I was listening to some of your remarks, the term anthropology came to mind, which is a subject I've never studied. But Annika, what you described, and the reason I want to buy your book, the communities you described, both are reminiscent of the pre-Enlightenment Judaism, right? And the early Zionist writers talk about the terrible trade-off that was involved with emancipation because we lost the comfort and the security of the shtetl for supposed emancipation, which never came about. And what you described with those communities was really pre-emancipation type of Judaism, for better or worse. And so the idea of keeping that seems to me to be very important, as you say, to just sort of round out, if only anthropologically, the nature of what does it mean to have Judaism in the world. Shmuel, when you were talking
Can you come to a question very soon?
The question for her, the answer is yes.
I
wanted to
will
keep
not
it
accept
short,
such mansplaining on the...
Are you concerned that with this age, related to the previous question, we hear a lot about growing ignorance among young Israelis about ignorance of Jewish tradition, ignorance of Tanakh, and so do we start to become, are you worried that this practice that is sort of instinctive becomes like the practice of conversos where they don't know why they're going down to the basement on Friday night, they just do what they do, but it becomes sort of practice without an awareness of what it means to be Jewish.
Okay.
The answer is, again, yes. I am concerned by it. I'm generally concerned by ignorance, not just ignorance of Judaism. I'm concerned with, ignorance of history, mathematics, philosophy, and many other fields. I do think there is a knowledge gap in Israel between what people do and what people know about what they do. And I think, at least in some quarters in Israel, you see groups of people wanting to fill this gap. You see young Israelis wanting to learn more, going to mechinot, going to such places, I think that's the gap they want to fill. They have enough practice, but they want to know more about their tradition.
Okay, I wasn't entirely clear what the question to me was.
It's a pre-enlightenment.
Yeah, but is that a question or? Yeah. No, I wasn't being facetious. Because I thought your question was for me. But okay. The answer is yes. What? No, but I agree with what you said. Yes, it is that. I do think that we should be very careful, though, not to view it as museum culture, because it isn't. It's not something, like, it's an actual thing that goes on in the world, and these communities are very vivid. So I think it's important not to keep the diaspora as pets and not to treat us as pets, but to understand that our culture is very important and to have a strategy on how to maintain it, again, without speaking down to us. That would be great.
Okay, final question. Okay. Lady here in the corner.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we said before, that Israelis are raised in a world in which worry about assimilation and worry about anti-Semitism is not a sixth sense that's cultivated. Jews that grow up in the diaspora are actually trained and develop that sense. So the irony is that even when Israelis move to places where there might be anti-Semitism, it can in fact take them longer to feel that it's actually there, which may be a good thing or a bad thing, right? It could be a negative in the sense that if you don't know what's surrounding you, you might not be able to respond to it well. But apropos what other people were saying before, if you don't see it around you, then you're going to live your Jewish life the way you want to live your Jewish life without any fear of the repercussions, perhaps, of the anti-Semitism. The Berlin Jewish community is a fascinating phenomenon all on its own. It's one of the world's fastest growing Jewish communities, actually, which is an irony of ironies in a lot of ways, but the world's an interesting place.
Would you like to?
I'll give one more statistic. In 1918, at the end of World War I, there were 60,000 Jews living in then Palestine. 30 years later, the state was born, 600,000 Jews, 10 times more. Last year, in 2018, we passed the 6 million mark. So it's 100 times more Jews within 100 years. If some choose to move to Berlin, I don't see any reason for concern. We are growing.
I'm going to end on a positive note as per the not noticing the anti-Semitism. I said to someone yesterday that I said, when I'm in Israel is the one, I talk about anti-Semitism and think about it a lot. When I'm in Israel is the only time I don't. It's also the only time that my neck doesn't hurt from being tense all the time. So in my mind, that's a pretty great thing, and I'm envious in a way of having grown up, being an Israeli child, growing up in a world where you have a different type of backbone and a different type of outlook. Yeah, well, there's a trade-off to everything, but I will say that I do envy that to some. There are other things I don't envy about growing up Israeli. But that's a pretty amazing thing. So I'll just end on a sweet note.
Thank you very much. It's nice to end on an optimistic note. There's been a lot of, I think inevitably, given what's going on at the moment, there's a lot of sort of gloomy talk, but I think we did end on a positive note, and that was great. And from my point of view, it's really wonderful to see so many of you here for this event. I want to thank Daniel Gordis, Shmuel Rosner, Annika Hermos-Rothstein again. Their books are on sale outside. They will sign those books for you, I think, yes. Yes, and I promised Annika that we're going to have her back when her books are out, so she can come for another event and sign your books then, okay? Thank you, everyone. Good night.